Okay, this is part 2 of my discussion about rhetorical situation in literary analysis. These videos only let me record for 15 minutes at a time, and I think it's important to talk about some of this other stuff. So I left off talking about purpose here. Let's go on to audience, and then we'll look at an example. So, the goal for this essay, at least one of them, is to convince your audience that your interpretation is at least possible, right? What's good and important to remember when doing any sort of analysis is that there is no right way to interpret. As long as you support your opinion about the text, then you're right. And you don't have to have the same interpretation as the quote-unquote accepted interpretation, right? So the primary ways that you're going to convince your audience are the same ways that you would write an argumentative essay or do any sort of persuasion. And it's doing two things. It's giving reasons for why you believe something is the way that it is, and giving evidence to prove this point that you're trying to make. The other thing to mention here, and like I said, we'll look at an example, is that in this case, since you're choosing your own text to write on, readers may or may not be familiar with the text you're analyzing. So what that means is that there should be some brief summary of what this poem or short story is about. If I assigned you an analysis where everybody in the class was all analyzing the same text, that probably would not be as important. But in this case, you don't want to assume that your audience is familiar with it. So I would say probably right after your intro, that's where you want to give maybe like a one paragraph summary of your text, what it's about. Again, you don't want to give away too much because you're going to be analyzing it more closely later in the essay. And what you can also do as you're analyzing is, maybe summarize information that the audience would need to know to understand why a character says something or a particular line. So again, that summary doesn't just have to happen in like one separate paragraph. It's something you can do in small ways throughout your analysis as well. So like I said, let's look at an example here. What I have is just a photograph. Again, sorry you can't really see all of it in the same frame here, but I think you can do an analysis of pretty much anything. You guys will be doing a poem or short story, but I think you could very easily analyze just even a photograph like this. So, it's fine to say whatever you want in terms of an interpretation, but like we said, it's that evidence and explanation that really makes that interpretation convincing. So it would not be enough for me to just look at this photograph and say, oh, this is about why child labor is wrong and why we should stop it. The thing is, I can say that, but without any sort of proof to back up that claim, it's not going to make a very good impression on my audience, right? So again, I would have to give some evidence as to why just this still photograph is an indictment of something like child labor, right? So I would have to give some proof. One piece of evidence is that this little girl, I interpret her face as being kind of sad, right? She's certainly not smiling or enthusiastic. Another piece of evidence is that this little girl is dirty. If I scroll down here, you can see even that she's in her bare feet, covered in dirt. Her dress is dirty and kind of hanging off of her, showing that, and again, maybe that's like more like an apron that's on the front of her, but the apron's dirty. It seems too big for her. So again, that might be a piece of evidence that, oh, the working conditions in this place wherever she is don't seem to be too sanitary, right? If we look at what's in the background behind her, this looks like this huge machine, right? And again, it's bigger than she is. So a question in our minds might be, why is a little girl like this, who we would estimate to be, maybe like 10 years old, if that, why is this little girl working with this like kind of scary looking machinery in the background, right? So again, I would start with, what do I notice about this text? And then start to draw some conclusions about it. Oh, I think that this photographer is trying to show that child labor, this is what it does to kids, right? It's stripping them of their innocence, making them sad, they're living in horrible conditions, that sort of thing. So again, anytime I would mention like a specific observation or piece of evidence in my essay, I'd have to explain it, right? So if I'm writing a paragraph and I say, this photograph shows that child labor is a bad thing. One piece of evidence that's given is the facial expression of this little girl. This is why this is about child labor and why it's bad. Just saying something like that doesn't make any sense, right? And again, maybe your audience can get the implication, right? Oh, she looks sad. But, they might not see the connection. What does this have to do with condemning child labor, right? You'd have to explain it as the author, right? Maybe you'd say something like, it seems like the photographer chooses this particular subject and has her pose in this specific way to show that she's not happy working in these conditions, and that probably a lot of little kids aren't happy working in these conditions. And this is why it seems like this photograph is actively trying to persuade its audience that child labor laws need to be reformed, right? This is a case where, going back to the purpose thing, it might be relevant to mention some context information, right? The thing is, at the time I looked this up, the photograph is from the turn of the century, probably like 1899, 1900, like very, very turn of the century. And at the time, child labor was a very common sort of practice. And there really were no strict laws about what you could not make a child do. They were treated like little adults, and oftentimes much worse, and could not handle the same sort of physical torment that adults could, right? They're working in mines, they're working in these factories for 16 hours a day, every single day, right? It might be important, if I were writing this essay, to make mention of that fact. Because if the audience doesn't know that that's going on at the time of this photograph, then they may say, well, what is child labor? What does this photograph have to do with that, right? Again, I would probably mention that this photographer, his name's Lewis Hine, he was both a sociologist and a psychologist, and he primarily took photographs of kids involved in child labor and made it his mission to try to change the practices surrounding child labor, right? Again, knowing that about this photographer makes my interpretation more convincing, right? So again, it's thinking about how relevant is that context information and how much of it should be included, right? Let me go back to my other document, flip back here. So again, that has to do with both purpose and audience. Figuring out how much of that summary or contextual information to include alongside these interpretations that you're making. The next rhetorical consideration here is stance, which again is like the attitude that you have toward your subject. So, the best way to see your text through interested and curious eyes, because again, in the learning activity here above, it's mentioned that you want to show yourself as being interested and curious about your subject is to actually be interested in it, right? That may seem like an obvious thing, but a lot of times I have students who I can tell are just writing about some text because, whatever, it's famous or it's easy. It's not that they're actually curious about it or, really care about investigating it. And that shows a lot of times. So this is why it's important when you're in this process of choosing a text that you pick something that you don't automatically kind of understand right off the bat. Something that's a little bit more complex or complicated. There's a famous playwright named Oscar Wilde, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase what he said because I don't remember the exact quote. But he said that the purpose of analyzing a text is not to figure out some riddle or try to take something complicated and simplify it into one clear interpretation. The purpose of analyzing is to look at something that on the surface seems fairly simple or one way, and that every time you look back at it, it becomes more mysterious and more complex and more interesting. If the text you choose isn't making you feel that way, you might abort and see if you can find something else, right? I mean, there are tons of poems and short stories available online. And it may take you a little time to choose something, but I think it's much better to go through that process rather than wasting time writing something that doesn't actually interest you or make you want to investigate further, right? Also, as far as stance, I said here, it might be a good idea to just start with basic observations about the text before you immediately try to start interpreting, right? Let me flip back to our picture for a second. So what I mean is, before I immediately jump to the conclusion, oh, what's this photographer trying to do here? Like, what's he trying to say? Before I even do that, I might just start by listing what I notice about it. Okay, it's a black and white photo. The little girl is our subject. She has a sad expression on her face. She's wearing dirty clothes and is in her bare feet. There's a bunch of junk on the floor where she's presumably walking around. There's a huge machine behind her. So just by starting with those facts about the text, those observations, a lot of times if I look at all of those things together, they might help me draw some conclusion about what that means. Probably if I looked at all those observations together, it would lead me to this idea, oh, it seems like this situation is bad, and the photographer is trying to make us aware of that reality of this little girl, right? So again, maybe that's something to do and just when you're like generating ideas before you actually start writing the draft. I would actually get those out in a Microsoft Word document or on paper so you can kind of look at all those observations and start figuring out how they might have something to do with the overall message of the text. So the last consideration is media and design. You're going to be looking at a verbal text, right? Not pictures, not multimedia, anything like that. So your focus should be on the language itself that's being used. So whereas in this photograph, I was looking at these visual images, your evidence is going to be on what's being said in the poem or short story. The other thing is that for this and for all the essays you're going to do in this class, you're going to be using MLA style. And that mostly matters with how you are citing your quotations. Because again, you should be including direct quotations from the poem or short story that you're analyzing. So for MLA style, the most important piece of information that needs to be included in parentheses after the quote is going to be either the page number if it's a short story or the line number if it's a poem. We're going to talk later, probably both in class and also in later learning activities, about how to incorporate quotations into your text. So be on the lookout for that information.